They say that when you're about to die, your entire life flashes before your eyes. For me, it wasn't my life that I saw, it was the truth I had spent my whole life running from. And that truth, it didn't just change me, it shattered me, piece by piece, until I was no longer the man I thought I was. My name is Jackson Hale, and this is the story of how I died, met Jesus, and had my entire world turned upside down. For most of my life, I thought I had it all figured out. I was a proud pastor of a progressive church in Los Angeles. My congregation adored me, my message of inclusivity inspired others, and my identity as a gay man was something I celebrated. I believed it was a reflection of God's creativity, His diversity, His love for all. That's what I preached to my congregation every Sunday. But behind closed doors, there were questions I didn't dare to ask out loud. You see, deep down, there was always this quiet voice that I tried to silence. A voice that would whisper late at night, "Is this really what God wants for you? Are you sure you're walking in His truth?" I ignored it, buried it under layers of theology, activism, and busyness. But the truth has a way of catching up with you, even when you think you've outrun it. It was an ordinary Sunday morning, like so many others before it. I had just delivered a sermon titled "Love is Love," a message that resonated with so many in my church. The applause was loud, the smiles were warm, and I felt a sense of pride as I stepped off the pulpit. The moment it happened, I knew something was wrong. 1 second, I was standing tall, shaking hands with the congregation, basking in the warmth of their admiration after my sermon. The next, I felt a sharp, crushing pain shoot through my chest, like a vice tightening around my heart. A sharp pain tore through my chest. It was sudden, like lightning striking out of nowhere. My breath caught in my throat, and the room seemed to spin in slow motion. I gasped for air, clutching at my chest, and I could see the alarm in their eyes, their faces frozen in shock and fear as I stumbled backward. "Pastor Hale!" Someone shouted, their voice sounding distant, like it was coming through water. My legs gave out, and I hit the floor hard. I remember the ceiling above me blurring as the pain consumed me. I could hear the panicked murmurs of the people around me, someone yelling for an ambulance, the frantic shuffling of feet. And then, silence. The world around me faded so quickly it felt like a switch had been flipped. No sound, no movement, just stillness. It wasn't darkness, though. It wasn't the nothingness I'd always imagined death to be. It was something else. Something far more profound. In that moment of silence, I became aware that I wasn't in my body anymore. It's hard to describe, but I could see myself lying there on the church floor, surrounded by people. I could see the paramedics rushing in, their faces tight with focus as they worked to bring me back. I could see my congregation praying, crying, holding hands. But I wasn't afraid. There was no panic, no pain. Instead, I felt a profound sense of peace, like I was being cradled by something greater than myself. And then, I began to rise. It wasn't like flying or floating in the way we think of it. It was more like being drawn upward, pulled gently but irresistibly toward a brilliant light in the distance. The light was warm, inviting, and alive. It wasn't just something I saw, it was something I felt, something that seemed to pulse with love and power. As I moved closer, I felt every burden I'd carried in life, the doubts, the fears, the questions, begin to lift away. I felt light, free, whole. And then I saw Him. I didn't need to ask who He was. I just knew. The moment I saw Him, I knew it was Jesus. His presence was overwhelming, but not in a way that frightened me. It was the kind of overwhelming that makes you want to weep because you know you're standing in the presence of pure, unfiltered love and truth. He looked at me, not with judgment, not with anger, but with a love so deep and so complete it felt like it could fill the universe. Yet, there was something else in His eyes, too. Something that wasn't condemnation but clarity. Truth. A truth I had spent my whole life avoiding. He didn't speak with His mouth, but I could hear him as clearly as if he had. His words weren't just words, they were alive, resonating in the deepest parts of my soul. He said, "Jackson, you've been searching for my love, but you've misunderstood it." In that moment, I felt exposed, not in a humiliating way, but in a way that made me realize there was nothing I could hide from him. He saw everything, every thought, every action, every justification I'd ever made. And yet, he didn't turn away. He didn't reject me. He just stood there, radiating a love that I had never known before. Then he showed me something. It wasn't like a vision or a dream. It started with a panoramic view of my life, every moment, every choice, every action. But it wasn't like watching a movie or flipping through a photo album. It was immersive. I could feel the emotions of every decision, not just my own, but those I had impacted. I saw the good I had done. I saw people whose lives had been touched by my ministry, those who found comfort in my sermons, those who were drawn closer to God because of the hope I shared. For a moment, I felt a deep sense of pride. But then, the picture shifted. I saw the times I had distorted His word, moments where I had bent Scripture to suit my own desires or the desires of others. I saw how I had led people away from Him, not intentionally, but through my failure to seek His truth over my own understanding. Jesus didn't condemn me for these things. His love never wavered, but I could feel the weight of how far I had strayed. He let me see the ripple effects of my actions, the confusion, the pain, the spiritual harm caused by my misinterpretations. It was like holding a mirror to my soul, and what I saw wasn't what I wanted to believe about myself. Then Jesus spoke to me, not with anger or judgment, but with a clarity that pierced through every lie I had ever told myself. He said, "Jackson, I designed love to reflect my covenant with humanity, sacrificial, pure, and in harmony with my creation. Anything outside of that creates confusion and pain." He explained that love wasn't about self-fulfillment or personal satisfaction. It was about aligning with His truth, living in obedience, and reflecting His character. True love, he said, is sacrificial. It's about giving, not taking. It's about living in a way that honors me and the design I created. He reminded me of the story of Adam and Eve, saying, "I created man and woman to complement one another, to be fruitful and multiply, and to reflect my unity in purpose." Their union wasn't just about companionship, it was a reflection of my love for my people, a covenant of harmony and truth. Jesus wasn't just talking about relationships, He was talking about the very fabric of who we are as His creation. He showed me how, when we step outside of His design, we create chaos, not just for ourselves but for the world around us. After the life review, Jesus showed me something else, something that left me in awe and trembling at the same time. I saw a place of unimaginable peace, a realm where His love was so overwhelming that it filled every corner. It was bright, warm, alive. There was no fear, no pain, no confusion, only perfect unity with Him. But then, the vision shifted. I saw what it looked like to be separated from Him. It wasn't a fiery pit or a place of physical torment, but something far worse, a complete absence of His presence. The emptiness, the darkness, the despair of being cut off from Him was more terrifying than anything I had ever imagined. And then, He showed me something specific, a glimpse of what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah. I saw the city, vibrant and full of life, but consumed by sin, pride, and self-indulgence. Jesus let me feel the sorrow He felt as He watched them turn further and further away from Him. "They rejected my design," He said, "and in doing so, they rejected me." He explained that it wasn't just their actions, but their hearts that led to their destruction. "They embraced their desires over my truth," He said. "And it wasn't because I stopped loving them, it was because they refused to let me in." It was a sobering moment. He wasn't showing me these things to instill fear, but to make me understand the consequences of living outside of His will. He wasn't telling me I was beyond redemption, He was showing me why His truth mattered so much. Then came the moment that changed me forever. Jesus looked at me with a love so profound that it brought me to my knees, if I even had knees in that place. He said, "Jackson, you are not unloved. You are not abandoned. But you've been looking for your identity in the wrong place. Your identity isn't in your desires, it's in me." Those words hit me like a tidal wave. For so long, I had defined myself by my feelings, by the labels the world had given me, by the identity I had constructed for myself. But in that moment, I realized that none of those things were who I truly was. I was his. I belonged to him, and that was the only identity that mattered. He told me, "I love you too much to let you stay the same. I have a plan for you, a purpose for your life that is greater than anything you can imagine. But to walk in that purpose, you have to let go of what you've been holding on to and trust me." I could feel the weight of his words, the invitation they held. It wasn't condemnation, it was freedom. Freedom to step into the life he had always intended for me. Freedom to align myself with his truth, no matter how hard it might be. Before the vision faded, Jesus spoke one final truth: "Jackson, my design for you is not to restrict you but to free you. I made you in my image, to reflect my love and my glory. When you walk in that truth, you will find the joy and peace you've been searching for." When I opened my eyes, the fluorescent lights of the hospital ceiling were the first thing I saw. They were harsh, cold, and unwelcoming compared to the warmth of the light I had just left. I could hear the faint beeping of machines and the hushed murmurs of nurses, but their voices felt distant, almost like echoes. My body felt heavy, like I was dragging 1,000 pounds of everything I had just experienced back into this world. I remember the doctor leaning over me, his voice full of relief. "You're lucky to be alive," he said, but I didn't feel lucky. I felt burdened. Burdened with the weight of what I had seen, what I had learned, and what I now knew I couldn't ignore. My chest ached, but it wasn't just physical pain. It was the ache of knowing I couldn't go back to who I was, to the life I had built before this moment. Everything had changed, and I could feel it in every fiber of my being. As I lay there in that hospital bed, tears began streaming down my face. Not tears of sorrow or fear, but tears of reverence, of humility. I whispered a prayer under my breath: "Lord, help me. Help me to be the person you've called me to be." Because deep down, I knew that the man who had delivered that sermon, who had collapsed on that church floor, no longer existed. I had died in more ways than one, and the person who came back wasn't the same. When I was discharged from the hospital, the world outside looked exactly the same, but I wasn't. I walked into my home, into my church, into my life, and it all felt unfamiliar, like I was seeing it through a different lens. And that's when the reality of what lay ahead hit me. Everything I had built, my identity, my relationships, my ministry, was rooted in a foundation that now felt shaky. I couldn't preach the same messages, couldn't hold on to the same beliefs, couldn't continue living a life that I now knew was out of alignment with God's truth. But change is never easy, and it wasn't for me. I wrestled with the fear of what people would say, of what they would think, of how they would judge me. Would my congregation understand? Would my friends still stand by me? Would I lose the very community I had poured my life into building? These questions haunted me day and night, but the answer was always the same: I had to change. Not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't unsee the truth. And living in that truth was worth any cost. I remember the first time I stood in front of my church after the experience. My hands trembled, my heart raced, but I knew I had to speak. I told them everything, about the collapse, about meeting Jesus, about what he had shown me. I told them about the love I had misunderstood, about the truths I had avoided, about the ways I had led them astray. Some cried. Some nodded. Others sat in stunned silence. And then there were those who walked out, shaking their heads, their expressions a mix of disappointment and anger. It was one of the hardest days of my life, but it was also one of the most freeing. One of the hardest parts of the transformation was watching relationships change. There were people who had stood by me for years, who had supported my ministry, who had called me a friend, who now wanted nothing to do with me. They felt betrayed, confused, even angry. And I understood. I didn't blame them, but it still hurt. I had to remind myself that following Jesus isn't about pleasing people, it's about obedience to him. I stepped down from my role as pastor, not out of shame, but out of a desire to seek God's truth wholeheartedly. I knew I couldn't stand in that pulpit and preach the same messages I had preached before. I needed time to relearn, to rebuild, to let God reshape my heart and my purpose. Stepping away felt like losing a part of myself, but it also felt like the beginning of something new, something real. During that time, I began sharing my story with anyone who would listen. It wasn't easy, and it often came with criticism and rejection, but I knew it was what I had to do. I told people about the encounter with Jesus, about the truths he had revealed to me, about the love that was greater and more profound than anything I had ever known. I told them about the burden and the freedom of stepping into his will. And to my surprise, there were those who listened, really listened. People who were searching for the same truth, the same love, the same freedom. People who wanted to know him the way I had come to know him. My relationships changed, my ministry changed, my life changed. And though the road was hard, it was worth it. Because every step I took brought me closer to him, to his truth, to the purpose he had for me all along. When I returned from that experience, I didn't just return to life, I returned to a truth I could no longer deny. One of the most significant changes in my life was my transformation from identifying as a gay man to embracing the man God created me to be. It wasn't a change born out of shame or fear, but out of love, a love so profound it showed me that my identity isn't in my desires but in him. This transformation wasn't about rejecting who I was, it was about stepping into who I was always meant to be. And it made me ask myself questions I had spent years avoiding. Am I living in alignment with God's truth? Am I letting the world shape my identity, or am I letting him define me? These are questions we all need to ask ourselves, no matter where we are in life. What about you? Are you living in alignment with his truth? Or are you holding on to something that deep down, you know isn't what he wants for you? It's not easy to face these questions, but I promise you, the answers are worth it. Because his truth doesn't bind you, it frees you. If you're watching this and you feel a tug in your heart, that's not me, that's God. And I want to encourage you to take the first steps toward him. Start with prayer. Find a quiet place, open your heart, and just talk to him. Ask him to reveal his purpose for your life, even if it's uncomfortable. Even if it challenges everything you thought you knew about yourself. Spend time in Scripture. Read his word not just to confirm what you already believe, but to discover his truth. Approach it with an open heart, ready to let it reshape your mind and your soul. The Bible isn't just a book, it's a roadmap to his design for your life, filled with wisdom, love, and guidance. And surround yourself with people who will encourage you in your journey. Find a community that will pray with you, challenge you, and walk alongside you as you seek to live in alignment with his will. I want you to hear this loud and clear, no matter where you've been, no matter what you've done, God's love is big enough to transform you. He's not asking you to be perfect. He's asking you to be willing, to trust him, to follow him, to let him lead you into the life he's prepared for you. His grace is bigger than your mistakes, your past, and your fears. It's not too late to turn to him. It's never too late to let his love change everything. If you're feeling lost, know that he hasn't forgotten you. If you're feeling unworthy, know that his grace is enough. If you're feeling like you've strayed too far, know that he's standing right there, arms wide open, waiting for you to come home. I'd love to hear from you. Have you had an experience that changed the way you see God? Has there been a moment in your life where you felt his truth, his love, his presence in a way you couldn't ignore? Share your story in the comments, I'd love to read it. And if you're just starting this journey, let us know how we can pray for you. You're not alone in this. If this story has spoken to you, I encourage you to share it. You never know who might need to hear this message, who might be searching for the same truth, the same hope, the same love that changed my life. God has a purpose for your life, and it's greater than anything you can imagine. Take the first step today. You won't regret it. If this story has touched your heart, or if you're searching for truth, love, and purpose, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. Together, we can explore what it means to live a life aligned with God's truth.